He stood under a tarpaulin that snapped in the warm wind, the deck pitching with a regular breath, the smell of diesel and rice and corded rope pressed into his clothes. Captain Ishida Taro of the Imperial Japanese Army, logistics officer attached to the 51st Division, had been given charge of crates that were more like arguments than supplies. Mortar rounds and field telephones and sacks of white rice, rifles and grease paper, a few light field guns lashed to the forward deck, drums of fuel that no one wanted near a cigarette. The transport had a name he had learned at the gangway and practiced under his breath as sailors. He did not command took lines off bollards. Aiyo Maru. She was one of 8 transports that gathered at Rabaul in early March 1943 for Operation 81. The route was a thread pulled across a blue cloth full of tears. Rabaul to La, through the Bismarck Sea and into the Huon Gulf, under a sky that belonged to no man. The convoy moved with 8 destroyers as escorts. Shirayuki, Asashio, Arashio, Tokitsukaze, Shikinami, Uranami, Yukikaze, and Asagumo to make a wall of steel in a place where walls could not hold. He walked among stacks of crates and felt the ship pull at her mooring lines and straighten like a runner finding stride. Rabaul fell away into a line of roofs and hills and guns. The smell of the place rode with them for a time, hot engine oil and smoke and bananas smashed in crate corners. He had passed through Rabaul twice in the last year and believed he knew its moods. Now it gave them a clear blue morning that lied with a smile. The men in his detail sat cross-legged among their gear, faces simple with the calm that comes when a plan is old and heavy. A sergeant counted his squad aloud and then counted his lucky charms under his breath. Ishida stood at the rail and watched the destroyer Shirayuki lift and fall with confidence. He wished he could borrow that confidence. He held instead to the facts. 8 transports with army troops and gear. 8 destroyers for speed and teeth. A plan written by men at tables. A date stamped by necessity. The Bismarck Sea under them. La ahead and the call of the 18th Army and the garrison at Salamaua rattling down the radio net like empty bottles. 5th Air Force had a name already on Japanese lips. The men said it at night when they walked between sheds, and they said it in the morning when a bright light came through cloud and someone listened for the first engine note. General George Kenny had made Port Moresby and Milne Bay into hands that could reach far across the Bismarck Sea. P-38 Lightning fighters rode high lines. B-17 Flying Fortress came in from altitude with the old habit of bombing neat boxes in the air. B-25 Mitchell and A-20 Havoc lived low, where the waves wore a face and the ships wore their names in spray. RAF Beaufighter crews from No. 30 Squadron ran toward ships with their cannon mouths smiling like wolves in old paintings. Ishida had learned to speak these names without the rage that used to break his breath. It was a list that kept a man honest. 5th Air Force, B-25 Mitchell, A-20 Havoc, RAF Beaufighter, P-38 Lightning, Sheep Booming. The Bismarck Sea did not care about names. It cared about timing. The first day was all motion without pain. The convoy moved at a rate that made the sea feel patient. The destroyers pushed white beards at their bows. Ishida marked time by the smell from the galley and by the shift in the tilt of light across canvas. A sailor with grease under his nails passed and called out a line about La as if the town were on a street corner and they could be there by nightfall. Another sailor, older, looked up once at the high sky and said nothing. The escort commanders knew where the danger would come from. The 11th Air Fleet promised A6M0 patrols from La and Rabaul, but the math of range and endurance had always been unkind over the Bismarck Sea. Ishida watched the destroyer Asashio cut a perfect line when she turned and felt a small glow in his chest. The burn a man steals from skill he does not possess. On the second day, the sky opened and offered the convoy a glimpse of its opponent. B-17 Flying Fortress came in high out of a white alley in the clouds and turned the convoy into a grid on a table. The first bombs came down in neat lines that did what neat lines always do in water. They made tall splashes that threw sunlight back into the air like angry hands. The convoy held course and changed course and held course again while Ishida and his men breathed in short stitches. Aiyo Maru took no hit in that pass. Another transport rocked under a near miss and went on, her men holding their shoulders against the shock as if they could lean the damage out of the ship. The destroyers threw black marks into the sky and made the sky shrug. The high bombers passed and were gone, and a murmur moved across the deck like water going backward. 5th Air Force had lifted a curtain. The convoy kept its shape with new angles. He slept under canvas, his boots still on, and dreamed a field in Kyushu he would not see for years. He woke to the slope of the deck telling a different story. Dawn had put a gray mat down on the Bismarck Sea, and the convoy sat on it as if waiting for a photograph. Ishida tasted metal. Sometimes the mouth knows what the eyes have not yet seen. The first bowfighters took shape as notches in the haze. They leveled off at mast height and spread into a fan. Number 30 Squadron RAF had flown out of Port Moresby eastward then north, then bent west toward the Bismarck Sea like a man deciding on one last drink. They came in with intent. Their cannon found the forward mounts on the transports and wrote sparks into steel. The men at the 25mm on the bow of Aiyo Maru reached for drums and for steadiness. The first pass shook the deck like a hard truth. Ishida saw a sailor he did not know look up with his mouth open and then look down and find work. The bowfighter passes stung and made the convoy bleed light. The main blow came with a new shape of motion. B-25 Mitchell from the 3rd Bomb Group and the 90th Bombardment Squadron, and a 20 Havoc from the 89th Attack Squadron, came in low and fast where the sea had hands and the ships had faces. Skip bombing was a phrase Ishida had heard in a room that smelled like ink and wool weeks earlier. He had imagined a rock thrown flat across a pond, the childish game given a uniform. He had not given it the weight it deserved. Now he saw a B-25 Mitchell run in at near mast height, the nose guns chattering to knock the air defense flat, the pilot holding steady enough to lay a straight line with his heart. The bomb left the belly of the aircraft, hit the surface of the Bismarck Sea, skipped once like a thing with laughter and then smacked into the flank of a transport 2 columns over. The explosion walked up the side of the ship and turned rooms into ideas. Skip bombing had turned theory into the daily bread of 5th Air Force. A P-38 Lightning pair sat above and behind the low attack and kept the sky from being a new problem. The A-20 Havoc ran their own lanes, slower, heavier in the belly with bombs that wanted honesty. They flew so low that Ishida could see the hot mouths of their engines chewing air smooth. The bowfighters came in again with cannon and guns, all noise, no waste, and tore at guns and faces and cables across decks. The air picture had been planned at Port Moresby on boards with colored string. Bowfighters to strike first and blunt the escort guns, B-25 Mitchell strafers to skip and kill, a 20 Havoc to add weight, P-38 Lightning to keep the top floor clean. It worked in the Bismarck Sea as if the sea had offered a stage. On the starboard side of Aiyo Maru, Ishida watched a bomb skip past the bow with a neat arrogance and strike the ship ahead of them in the column. The name on that hull had been told to him at anchor and he could not find it now. The hit shook water into the air and turned 2 men on that ship into black dots that fell without a sound. He caught the rail with both hands and his fingers found the rust and paint as if the steel were a friend. The 25mm mount on his bow found a line of bullets and spat it at a B-25 Mitchell that had already done its work. The aircraft went on, low and sure, and Ishida understood with a clarity that would never leave him. Speed and practice had given 5th Air Force a hand on his shoulder. Destroyers answered as they were born to do. Shirayuki threw 5-inch shells at the lanes the B-25 Mitchell ran. Arashio pulled closer to cover a wounded transport and made herself large, a kindness that costs. Asashio turned in tight circles to fight low attackers with a short arc Tokitsukaze cut behind smoke to put new weight where a gap had opened. Their gunnery crews burned their hands on hot breech blocks and opened and closed their hearts with every range call. They put up flak that turned the air into a field of sticks. P-38 Lightning pilots kept a circle at 8,000 and watched for Zero fighters that did not come often enough. The sky belonged to 5th Air Force in that hour because the Bismarck Sea had let them gather every piece they needed. Ishida had no rancor left for doctrine. He saw only men flying straight and ships running true and a series of decisions written in light and metal. A bomb struck Aiyo Maru forward of the bridge. It tore into the deck, kissed the hold where crates of mortar rounds lay like eggs in straw, and wrote a white and red sentence from the bow to the mainmast. Ishida fell onto his back and the deck took his breath like a bully. He rolled and tasted smoke as if it were food. The men in his detail grabbed irons and lines and pulled toward the breakwater in front of the hold. All sanity gone from that space, only duty left. Fire is a nation. It flies its own flag and speaks a language men hear in their sleep. Aiyo Maru spoke with that tongue. Ishida nodded to a corporal who needed no prompt, and both men ran toward the hatch to close it, to starve a small part of a big thing. He heard alongside the different sound of water turning at a new angle and looked to see Shirayuki pull across their starboard quarter, as if to put herself between the next pass and the wound in Aiyo Maru. In the same breath, AB-25 Mitchell came off the beam toward the destroyer line and released clean. The bomb did not skip. It hit. Shirayuki staggered and then opened, white and black and orange, a flower that no one loves. She took the blow near the bridge, and the light that came off her made Ishida blink like a fool. A gun mount on Shirayuki tried to keep firing for 3 seconds and then fell quiet like a good soldier. Men leapt and were thrown, and the sea took them because the sea always honors gravity over prayer. Ishida grabbed the wheel of the forward hatch and turned until his wrists burned. The metal moved. The smoke breathed and pulled at hair. Behind him the 25mm mount coughed and stopped, then found itself again. He felt a hand at his elbow and then another, and the hatch came down. He knew it was not enough. Fire now lived behind steel. It would try every key in the lock and find its way through. He looked over the rail and saw someone on a raft that had not been on the deck a minute earlier. He saw a head of hair and thought of a boy in a summer school in Kumamoto. Then he saw nothing but water and the lines of wake where B-25 Mitchell kept coming. A ship near the rear of the column finished a new shape. Smoke rose and began to look like a city without words. Asashio moved to rescue men from a sea that had teeth in every color. Arashio followed because escort doctrine says you do not let a sister stand alone. Tokitsukaze took a near miss and limped, the white under her paint showing where steel had stretched. The convoy was no longer a convoy. It was a series of lives drawing circles around themselves, and those circles overlapping sometimes and sometimes not at all. 5th Air Force kept the pattern on their side orderly. Beaufighter. B-25 Mitchell. A-20 Havoc. P-38 Lightning. Skip bombing working with strafing and suppression to make a morning that would echo in classrooms for years. He saw a B-25 Mitchell run directly at the bow of Aiyo Maru, far too low to make sense to a man not wearing the aircraft. The guns stitched the water and then the deck. The bomb left and skipped and struck a point near the waterline on the port side. The ship sat down with a sigh so deep it seemed like a man lying down and refusing to get up. Ishida felt the shift in the deck under his feet and knew the mathematics had become an order. He turned and waved his men toward the starboard lifeboat, even as he knew that low passes would cut their rope lines in a minute. The lifeboat made it into the water with a heavy slap. Men stumbled into it and found oars and prayer. He helped the last man at the davit and then looked once more at the ship that had been his address. Aiyo Maru stayed upright with a stubbornness that made him love her. Fire made it a temporary love. Plates buckled near the bow. A-20 Havoc strafed the forward deck and the green paint turned black in streaks. He did not watch her die. He leapt. The Bismarck Sea caught him in the chest with a shock that made the heart say things it only says once. He came up choking fuel and salt. He found a board, then a body that might have been a board, then a line that was real. He kicked to the line and held it with fingers that did not seem old enough to do such a grown thing. Around him the Bismarck Sea became a floor of men who could not stand up. He turned in the water in time to see the escort destroyers fight on inside a dream. Asashio had slowed to get men from the water near Shirayuki, and near the broken back of a transport whose name he wished he could say for the men who had lived on her. Arashio turned to cover a large target with a soul. 5th Air Force did not forget these acts. A B-25 Mitchell came out of low cloud and made an arc that brought it down like a thrown hammer. The bomb hit Arashio aft and the destroyer bent in a way steel pretends it cannot. She still fired. Another pass and a second hit took choice away. Asashio raised men and courage, and then a B-25 Mitchell caught her amid rescue. The destroyer took 2 hits in a minute that made her choose the deep. Tokitsukaze was alive, and then she was a wounded animal, smoke thick and stubborn. P-38 Lightning watched and kept the high air unworried. Ishida drifted and looked. There is a kind of learning that visits a man only when he does not hold a pen. 5th Air Force had made the Bismarck Sea into a textbook that wrote itself in spray and blood. Skip bombing had moved the decision from a high arc to a flat strike. B-25 Mitchell carried guns in the nose to slap the head of the target before placing the blow. Bowfighters broke the teeth that would bite the low attackers. A 20 Havoc added weight and insisted. P-38 Lightning kept watch. It was simple and therefore beautiful. It was violent and therefore true. He thought of the 51st Division officers waiting at La with chalk and board to receive men and crates. He thought of the rice in his hold that would never be eaten. He saved air for the next wave. The attack did not last long in the telling. It lasted forever in the body. The sky pulled back finally and the water took more than a man can write. The ships left upright were a few. The destroyers left with speed were the ones that had been told they could not stay. The P-38 Lightning wheeled once like a hawk and then slid off to the east. The B-25 Mitchell and A-20 Havoc fell away in pairs and fours, their pilots counting in their heads, measuring fuel back to Port Moresby and Dobadura. RAF Bowfighter slanted away toward Milne Bay and counted guns and their own small sins. The Bismarck Sea lay full of wood and rope and men and oil. The outline of Huon Gulf far to the south and La beyond the Cape looked calm, which is an offense sometimes. He found at last the side of a destroyer with a name that he could not read from water level. Men leaned over the rail and through lines. A hand took his forearm with unnecessary gentleness and hauled. The deck under him was blessed and hard and full of other men coughing up fuel and their beliefs. A petty officer slapped his back to make his lungs remember. He went to his knees and saw the Bismarck Sea over the edge and thought it beautiful again, which he resented. He would never forgive a sea for beauty in such a moment. The destroyer made speed because that is what a destroyer knows, and ran the broken lanes to get clear. 5th Air Force returned on the 4th of March to lay more weight on the pieces that still floated. Tokitsukaze was finished under the hands of airmen who measured their work without delight. Other ships that had carried men and crates and hopes were scuttled by guns that had once been loyal only to salvation. Ishida stood with a blanket on his shoulders and a strange calm in his hands. He had lost his ledger and his best sergeant and most of his cargo and the illusions he had carried across the Bismarck Sea. He still had breath and the strength to hold a rail. He held the rail as the destroyer lifted and cut a white line across a blue field. Later, in a room with a dry floor, men spoke numbers. The Bismarck Sea attack had destroyed the convoy that had left Rabaul with 8 transports. Aiyo Maru, Aiyo Maru, Oigawa Maru, Nojima Maru, Shirayuki Maru, Kembu Maru, Tio Maru. These names were spoken like a rosary that had cut fingers raw. 5th Air Force had used skip bombing at low altitude and had proven the tactic against moving convoy targets. RAF Bowfighter had led with strafing to blind the guns. B-25 Mitchell had made the water into a runway for their bombs. A-20 Havoc had kept the killing square from collapsing. P-38 Lightning had watched from above and made sure no one interrupted the work. The Japanese escort destroyers had fought with discipline and care and had paid in steel and men. Shirayuki gone. Asashio gone. Arashio dying. Tokitsukaze dead after suffering. The rest scarred. The road to La was open in a terrible way. The 51st Division would not receive what Ishida had promised. He lived in the narrow strip of time that follows disaster, where even breathing feels like an experiment. He walked a wharf at Wewak with a limp from a sprain he had misnamed. He watched the line of the shore and knew that ships would not cross that line in daylight without fear again for a long time. He wrote letters by lamplight naming men who would not read them. He listed crates that would never be lifted. He learned to count by absence. He learned new names. Huon Gulf, Finschhafen, Salamaua. He learned that 5th Air Force had made the sea between Rabaul and La into a hunting ground that favored the hunter. He learned that the phrase skip bombing would live in enemy reports and in training notes and in stories told by men with hands that shook when not holding a cup. He told his own story in a quiet way when anyone asked. He said the Bismarck Sea looked clean in the morning and looked honest at noon and looked cruel by afternoon. He said Rabaul was a place of beginnings and endings and did both too often. He said that 5th Air Force out of Port Moresby and Milne Bay had built a plan with B-25 Mitchell, A-20 Havoc, RAF Bowfighter, and P-38 Lightning that made the air over water a weapon. He said that skip bombing turned the bomb into a spear that men could aim with their breathing. He said that destroyers with names like Shirayuki and Asashio and Arashio and Tokitsukaze had hearts that could not be killed by sentences, only by weight of steel and fire. He said that La had called and that the sea had answered. He said he did not hate any man who had flown straight that day in March 1943. He walked once, years later, under a wing that had once carried bombs low across the Bismarck Sea. The placard said B-25 Mitchell and gave a squadron number like a street address for ghosts. He stood at a railing and read lines about skip bombing as if he were a student again. He closed his eyes and felt the sea climb his face. He opened them and saw the curve of a nose that had spit fire and lead and discipline. He touched nothing. Touching was for houses and for people. He let the air do the touching for him. He did not preach. He described. He said 5th Air Force by name. He said B-25 Mitchell and A-20 Havoc and RAF Beaufighter and P-38 Lightning until the students in front of him felt them as the bones of a single body. He said Bismarck Sea and saw their faces make the shape of a map they had never held. He said Rabaul and La and Huon Gulf and watched their mouths try the words and find the salt in them. He said skip bombing and did not smile. He said Operation 81 and watched the room learn how words can be neat and days can be ugly. He kept one sentence in his mouth for when someone demanded a moral and would not leave without it. He said Japanese convoys were overwhelmed by U.S. skip bombing in the Bismarck Sea in March 1943 because 5th Air Force built a method with B-25 Mitchell A-20 Havoc RAF Beaufighter and P-38 Lightning that used low-level power and timing to break the line between Rabaul and La, because skip bombing carried bombs across the skin of the sea and into the ribs of ships, because the escorts could not be everywhere at once, because the sky belonged to Port Moresby and Milne Bay on those days, and because the Bismarck Sea is a place that does not forgive the second mistake when the first mistake was to be seen.